So far, I've been having an absolute blast with Cold Sorceress. I've now done up to tier 9 maps. So far, I haven't had any feelings of my damage falling off. Before, my defenses did feel a little sketchy, but after getting my third Ascendancy, I invested into going CI, and now everything is feeling absolutely wonderful. So, in today's video, I'm going to go over my build, talk about some of the changes I made, and the logic behind them. But one thing to keep in mind, the game is constantly changing throughout the early access process, so be sure to get subscribed and ring that notification bell to be aware of future uploads, including if a build gets nerfed and I end up pivoting to something else. The main reason that I've been playing Cold Stormweaver still is because cold damage adds a lot of safety. Frozen enemies can't attack you. And also, it's still fun to drop comets on things' heads, and if you invest enough, you can actually do it pretty frequently. CI makes you super tanky. I went from having like 1.6k life to 5.5k energy shield, which is just a world of difference. I cannot tell you how much tankier I feel now. So I've been having a lot of fun with the build. For now, let's get into some very important mechanics. First up, how do you clear when playing? Step 1 is to throw Frostwall ahead of you. Basically cast this directly on enemies. Then launch all of your fireballs into it. The reason this works so well is when Fireball hits a wall or an object like a Frostwall crystal, it explodes, dealing damage and releasing secondary projectiles. Now, if you do this in an enclosed area, like say Frostwall crystals, those projectiles instantly shotgun everything for absolutely absurd damage. There are times where I'll put everything down on, say, an essence, click the essence 3 times, bam, dead, instantaneously. Doesn't even get to move or attack, it is just deleted from existence, which is super fun. That also means this build is far more effective if you are using it in tight corridors, though it works pretty okay in open maps because of the Frostwall stuff. A lot of this is from the Wild Shard support, and yes, it's possible that either Wild Shards or Fireball gets nerfed, but whereas the trigger stuff felt like something GG didn't really want, super easy, automated, OP one-button kind of stuff, this is a skill combo. You have to drop the Frostwall, then detonate it, which is much more in line with what GGG is encouraging with their skill design, so I suspect it's going to be viable even if it gets nerfed. But again, I cannot tell the future. That may be completely incorrect, and if so, I will make a future video updating you. Now, on rares, bosses, generally tanky enemies, drop Frostbomb first. This strips away enemy cold resistance, because as a Stormweaver, you basically get to set things to 80% lower than their baseline. So if an enemy has 75% res, it goes down to -5, meaning it takes roughly 4 times the base damage. If it starts at 0, it goes to -80, meaning it takes about 80% more damage. Then, drop some Frostwalls, hit Elemental Invocation to drop a Comet on their head. This should detonate most of the Frostwalls. And then you can go ahead and Fireball them if they happen to still be alive, but most of the time, I'm going to be honest, they don't survive the Comet. Now, if an enemy is low, you can also cull them with Lightning Warp. This is a movement skill that explodes an enemy that's in culling range, releasing a bunch of lightning damage, deals damage to everything around it, and it creates a shocking zone that increases enemy damage taken. With some shock effect, or shock magnitude, you can scale this up to 50%. And as a Stormweaver, this stacks twice. My understanding is this multiplies with itself. In other words, 1.5 times 1.5, not 1.5 plus 0.5. So, enemies take about 225% of normal damage when standing in 2 shock zones. Because all of your damage, including cold damage, can shock, enemies also have a pretty significant damage increase from things like your Frostwalls detonating and your Comets. That's part of why Stormweaver does absolutely massive damage right now, and it really frees you up to invest into your defenses. So, defensively, what does this build do? First up, Temporal Chains Blasphemy. This is to slow all nearby enemies. Personally, I found it is far more effective to slow things down with Blasphemy so that I can manually avoid them, rather than using something like Enfeeble, which would cause them to deal less damage directly, since it honestly doesn't reduce their damage by that much, and I would rather not take a hit at all because I can use Dodge Roll, than to use Enfeeble and take, say, 90% of a hit, instead of 100%. That said, if you are really bad at dodging, you could swap this out for something else. For example, you could go with Grim Feast so that as you kill enemies, you're able to get energy shield back. Alternatively, you could go with something like Blink for additional mobility, as that turns your dodge roll into a teleport. As a note, If you think your damage is completely fine and you want even more defenses, you could instead drop the Cast on Freeze for one of these alternative options such as Blink or Grim Feast. And so with the basics of how you play out of the way, let's get into how you build, starting with the passive tree. So, if you saw my last video where I talked about my immediate pivot, this is going to look really, really different. The main reason for this is the build is now Energy Shield. And also it's non-crit, because as I was playing around with nodes, I realized you can't very easily go both crit and Energy Shield. Kind of a pick one or the other. I'm assuming if your gear gets better and better and better, you might be able to go both. But for now, I decided to go for Energy Shield, because my issue wasn't killing enemies, it was being a little bit squishy and dying. I do think going Mind Over Matter is a perfectly viable alternative route, but I didn't end up exploring that because Energy Shield's just really cool and chaos damage sucks. So, for pathing, start here, go up through Pure Energy, and then realistically you can either go left or right for faster start of recharge or recharge rate. This will cause your Energy Shield to start charging faster. This will cause your Energy Shield to recharge faster once it starts. So if you think you're good at avoiding stuff, go here. If you think you are bad at avoiding stuff, go here. Then you continue up. Dampening Shield is really nice because it adds Energy Shield as an additional stun threshold. And Rapid Recharge is recharge rate and faster start. One thing to note, you will see a bunch of dexterity and a bunch of intelligence. Ignore the exact placement of my nodes on the trait. This is just for my current character and my current gear. The much more important thing is that you have enough intelligence and enough dexterity to not only use all of your supports, but to support Elemental Invocation, which requires Dex, and most of your gear, which requires Int. So in my personal gear, it looks like I need around 150 intelligence for the items. And for my personal Elemental Invocation, at level 11, I only need 52 Dex. That said, if you have a higher level Elemental Invocation, you will need more. But if you get a little Int or Dex on gear, that should solve all of these problems. You'll also need 30 Strength, but exactly how you get it and exactly how you get your resistances doesn't really matter. Just because I have Cold Res on my boots, if I even have that, does not mean you need it. Just because I have Int on my helmet doesn't mean you need it. You need to meet the requirements for your build. Where it is doesn't matter. If you just try to blindly copy, unless you are literally wearing all of my items, it's probably not going to go well for you. So, coming back here, Insightfulness is really good as it provides a ton of Energy Shield and some mana regen. Melding, also really good. The mana reduction hasn't been too noticeable. Potent Incantation, kind of anti-quality of life, but it is a lot of spell damage, so I've kept it for now, mostly because I'm also going to be pathing to Royal, as the increased area effect from Royal feels really, really good. This whole section could be dropped later, though. Something else that I would classify as experimental is Asceticism. I got tired of getting stunned, even with a stun charm. Sure, the charm would go off, the stuns would stop, but it was annoying. So I decided to grab this for now. That said, with more and more and more Energy Shield, it's entirely possible that things like Dampening Shield, and I believe there's some other nodes here, yes, like Eldritch Will, could ultimately end up completely replacing these nodes later. But hey, right now, you gotta be near them for Echoing Frost and Echoing Thunder, because you're basically always going to be shocking and chilling enemies. This is a nice, easy 60% damage. Alternating Current is really good. It provides mana regeneration rate and magnitude of the shock you inflict. In other words, when you shock an enemy with something like Comet, it causes them to take even more damage. This idea is also the thought process behind anointing Unbound Forces, which requires Disgust, Envy, and Guilt. Costs like 8 exalts currently, but prices are going to change all the time. The idea here is magnitude of shock, so enemies take more damage, and also the shock duration, which counteracts strike twice. For Ascendancy nodes, first thing is Scouring Winds. Now, until you do your third Ascendancy, you won't be able to do this. So instead, you would go into Mana and Constant Gale, and you wouldn't really get any benefits from shock scaling, so you simply don't take those nodes and invest in spell damage or defenses instead. I'll try to remember to make a planner on max roll with an alternative tree, but no promises, because if it seems really awkward and not worth it, I'm just going to be like, yeah, it's really awkward and not worth it, and you should swap to this once you get third lab, because the gear does require a decent bit of investment anyway. Then for the rest of the tree, coming up here, Shattered Crystal, super important. Without this, it's going to be incredibly difficult to deal enough damage to actually detonate the frost walls, because yes, as you level the gem up, it gains more damage, but also the walls gain more life, making them harder to destroy. So you reduce that as much as possible. And then Dreamcatcher, which means your foci needs to be really good. The more ES you can get on the focus, better. In that case, also use a rune for increased armor evasion and energy shield. And focus defense, absolutely significant. 5.5, 4. 1.5k ES just from a focus, in large part due to these nodes. So they are super OP. Coming over here, this is all still really, really good for the extra damage and making sure you instantly freeze stuff. I do suspect long-term this is probably something worth dropping, as the build does more and more damage and also freezes more and more easily. Then again, who knows? Maybe at like T15, T16 maps, I'm like, it's really hard to freeze stuff. I'm going to keep these nodes for a while. Don't mind this jewel socket being empty. I'll explain that in just a second. Then overexposure for exposure scaling and increased damage for each type of ailment. Enemies should be chilled, frozen, and shocked most of the time. So that's a lot of damage. I do also think that coming over here is a pretty strong damage alternative. So when I do end up dropping these nodes, that might be where I'm going. The only reason to not do that right now is because it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, as opposed to 1, 2, 3, 4. At least assuming these are all going to get kept. But hey, that's an optimization for future me. Refocus is really, really good because it's increased energy shield recharge rate. The higher the recharge rate, the more ES you gain per second. As you can see, it is about 1.6k, which feels really, really good. And the higher the delay modifier, the faster it starts recharging. Over 100% feels really good to me, but your mileage may vary a little bit. Next up, Endless Blizzard, +1 to level of all cold skills. This scales everything above a fireball. Glaciation for more cold exposure effect. Again, the resistance penetration doesn't do anything because that stops when an enemy reaches 0. I'm pretty sure this is already going into the negatives on everything. And yes, I'm going to keep saying this in every video. And last up, Inescapable Cold, which honestly, the freeze duration is really good. The build-up, it's okay. Then coming over here, Thin Ice is a nice conditional damage multiplier for when you freeze enemies and instantly obliterate them. Chaos Inoculation is an insane defensive layer. Chaos damage is super effective against Energy Shield. It removes twice as much ES as the damage taken. In other words, you take double damage. Chaos resistance is very hard to get on gear, so capping it is a huge pain. And Poison, which is a subtype of Chaos, completely bypasses ES. All those things suck. So you just completely immune it all. Now, if something does chaos damage, you get to laugh at it. You take no damage. It is wonderful. And last but not least, because this build is still using trigger stuff, Invocated Efficiency for Mana Sustain and Energize to retain energy as skills trigger. This feels really, really good. And to be honest with you, I like it a lot. I'm probably not going to drop it. But if you're really starved for points, it's not super crucial, especially if you drop something like the Cast on Freeze and you're only using Elemental Invocation. So if you're feeling really squishy and you're like, man, I need ES, I'm super squishy, help, you could easily grab stuff like this by dropping these nodes. Now for jewels, I'm actually in the middle of swapping out my jewels as I was making this video, but meta skills gain energy. Again, this is a double trigger build. Having extra energy feels really good. If you're not using double trigger, don't worry about that mod. Just focus on things like maximum energy shield. That should make your jewels way, way cheaper. Cold damage is nice, but certainly not required. Then faster start of ES recharge. That actually feels really good. The penetration here, useless, but hey, Regal Orbs are fun. Meta skills gain energy. Here, increased maximum energy shield, area of effective curses to affect things with the blasphemy more easily, and meta skills gain energy. For this last slot, I am trying to get recover 2% of mana on kill. They are a little bit pricey at the moment, So it's probably going to take a bit. But having 1 mana on Kill Jewel really helps with the mana sustain. And that's why this socket is currently empty. These are a bit more affordable if you don't get something like Energy Shield on it. So don't worry about that if you're on a budget. In general, for the other jewels, they cost, well, depends on your luck. This one was like 5x. I think this one cost me 10. That said, prices are always subject to change. They're going to change a ton, so you should price check for yourself and not go on this video. So that, it's time to start talking about the gearing. Starting with the weapon. The base type of a wand doesn't matter. What matters is using a wand so that you can have a focus in your offhand. Now, gaining 25% of damage as extra cold is a really good way to scale the build, as is +3 to level of all spell skills. I would say 25%, or let's just say percent of damage is extra, and all spell skills should be the core of your wand. In addition, I really like cast speed. Personally, I think cast speed is awesome, and it makes the build feel way more performant. So I would also advocate for that, but if those wands are pricey, you can do without. Just to give you an idea, it's a 1.27 second cast time up to 1.59. So there's a higher chance you'll get hit, especially when you're casting Fireball. The build may not feel as performant, but it's not like it completely stops functioning. One thing that will cause the build to stop functioning, though, is if you don't have Blue Flame Bracers. These convert 100% of fire damage to cold damage. In other words, this is not Fireball, this is Cold Ball. This means your Fireball can easily freeze enemies and scales off of all of your cold modifiers instead of your fire modifiers. Minus plus to level of cold skill gems because it is still a fire skill gem, as you can see here. But that's why you use all spells that'll scale it anyway. Now for the helmet, first up you want Energy Shield. Then for the suffixes, you want resistances and attributes. Having mana is a plus, but absolutely not required. Ideally, this definitely shouldn't have the double mana roll. It should be like ES mana hybrid, and more Energy Shield. But hey, it's got 281 ES, and that's a pretty damn solid starter item. And try to socket an Iron Rune for the increased armor evasion and Energy Shield, assuming you're able to cap your resistances without resistance runes. Now for the boots, you want movement speed, 25 to 30% minimum, as much ES as possible. Ideally, I would say around 200, and then resistances if you can find them. But I wouldn't worry too much about getting resistances on boots, just because it is a little bit more difficult, especially when you want very good prefixes. Similarly, on your foci, you're going to be spending a good bit of currency here. This is one of a few items that I actually did spend quite a while shopping around for. You absolutely want as much ES as possible, because remember, you got that absolutely massive bonus to the ES on your focus from your tree. And you want at least +2 to level of all spell skills. This could easily get pricey. I paid, I think it was around 20 exalts for this one, which is a very big difference when I paid closer to 10 exalts for things like my helmet, my boots, and my rings. Again, prices are subject to change. Price check things for yourself. Don't just assume it is the same price, because it almost never is. But because that's so important, don't worry about the fancy stuff. Don't worry about getting fire res here. Don't worry about intelligence, and don't worry about cold damage. If you're lucky, you could get something this good or maybe even better, especially as the league goes on. But if you are not lucky, and you try to copy this exactly, you could pay 50 or even 100 exalts for an item that absolutely isn't worth that. Once you've got all that, the next thing to do is buy a chest piece and an amulet. On chest piece, you want a lot of ES. Personally, I would recommend going for 400 or 500, because again, chest piece is a big source of ES. 5.5, 3.4, about 2,000 ES just from the chest piece. If you can get a base with something like mana regen or faster start of Energy Shield recharge, that's really good. But to use all the triggers outlined in this build, you need spirit. And between your chest and your amulet, you need at least 80 spirit. That could be 50 and 30, that could be 40 and 40, any combination, but you need 80 total. So again, look for ES, look for spirit. Those are all prefixes. Don't worry too much about the suffixes. Just, again, really, really try to get at least 500 energy shield, as that's going to make a huge difference in your build defenses. This chest piece cost me 30 exalts. It was pretty pricey, but I would say it is absolutely worth it. And for amulet, the really important stats are increased maximum energy shield and spirit. As you can tell, I have some non-optimal stats on here. I've got chaos res. That doesn't do anything. I've got life. That doesn't do anything. I've got evasion rating. That doesn't do anything. I've got completely useless stats. I don't even think the cold res does anything right now. But it has a spirit. It has increased maximum energy shield. And also, this was cheap. This was like 5x, I think. So if you get a cheap amulet, go ahead and put it on. You can always replace it with something pricier later. Again, I don't know what the price of the amulets are going to be when you look. After that, for rings and belt, your main goal is to fill in resistances and attributes. So I'm not really going to spend very much time talking about these because the exact rolls on them doesn't matter. If you are lacking fire res, it doesn't matter that I have lightning res on my ring because you don't need lightning res. So try to fill in with whatever you're missing using your rings and your belt. P.S. Belt can roll strength as a suffix, so that's a good way to get the 30 strength you need for your blue flame gloves. And after that, look for things like cast speed and mana regen, which are really nice for quality of life. Last up, flasks and charm. Your life flask does not matter. You don't even need to have it equipped anymore. It doesn't do anything because you have no more life. For charm, I've been using the stun charm, but I think very shortly I'm going to try out a thawing charm. So far, I haven't been frozen very frequently, but my freeze threshold is now really low because I'm pretty sure it's still based off of my life, which is 1. So any enemy that could freeze me will do so instantly, which is kind of unpleasant. So I'm going to try out a thawing charm and see if the stuns actually matter. The more ES you have, the less relevant stuns are going to be, because remember, the chance for an enemy to stun you is based on their damage relative to your stun threshold, which is the percentage of your energy shield. If you're undergeared, I suspect this is still the best, as you are much more likely to be stunned, something that can happen from any damage, than you are to be frozen, something that only specific enemies do. Last up, but certainly not least, mana flask. Yes, this is the same one from before. Yes, I should have charges gained per second as a suffix. Yes, I am too lazy to fix it because it hasn't been a problem. So, last but not least, skills. First up, mana drain. This is the wand skill for the wand base. Ignore it. In theory, if you're really running low on mana, I guess you could use it. It does leech 148 mana. So you'll get that back by hitting an enemy, but it's not really worth it unless you are really and also out of flask charges. As you may notice, I don't even have it on my bars because I haven't run into that situation since equipping this weapon. Frostwall. This is a bulk of your damage, so you want a lot of damage supports, like Controlled Destruction. The reason I went for this is because it had really low crit to begin with, and the build's no longer scaling crit. So instead of a 14% chance to deal a big chunk of damage, I decided to go with this for now. In the future, investing into crit more, it might be worth swapping that out. Now, one thing that I did think about was doing this. Problem there is, I noticed that the build felt much better when I wasn't using Concentrated Effect on Frostwall. I don't yet know how much of a difference it makes for shotgunning on a single target, but when clearing, it definitely feels much better to have the larger explosion radius. Then Icicle, so the ice crystals have less life. As you can see, 5.7 to 2.8. That means you'll need to do 2.8k damage, which is much, much easier. And Spell Cascade, which causes additional walls to form and then get detonated, which is a massive damage increase. Next up, Frostbomb. This is where I put the Concentrated Effect, because I kind of just drop it on a single target anyway, and it doesn't matter too much. It has okay AoE even with the Conk effect. Then considered casting for more damage at the cost of some cast speed. Since it's not being cast too frequently, having a slower cast time isn't that bad, especially since it's a pretty fast cast to begin with. Then strip away to make the exposure far more effective. Lightning Warp is pure utility. This is culling and creating the shock ground. So, Overcharge increases the magnitude of a shock, but it has less shock duration. As far as I can tell, this doesn't lower the duration of the ground, this lowers the duration of shock specifically. But since enemies count as shocked on the ground, there is no downside. Then Arcane Tempo, so that it feels more responsive. You could easily put Arcane Tempo on anything else if you have a 5-link, but I don't yet. And Persistence, so the shock ground lasts even longer. Then Fireball. This is the secondary damage skill that combos with Frostwall. First up, Scattershot. This way, it fires multiple projectiles. Combine that with Unleash because you are not chain casting it, and you will very often build up 2 charges like this, and fire a nice little salvo. Or your Wild Shards will proc. That was Wild Shards. With Wild Shards, instead of firing a couple projectiles forwards, you fire a whole bunch in a Nova, which is absolutely hilarious in tight spaces. This is very good for shotgunning, especially at point-blank range, and results in massive damage. Next up, all the triggers. In order of importance, first up, Elemental Invocation. This is the Comet you have to manually activate and drop on enemies. This should be your highest level Comet, and you should support it with Spell Echo and Inspiration. Spell Echo for damage, Inspiration to make the mana cost more manageable, because Comet mana costs are kind of ridiculous. Then next up, the second Comet for Cast on Freeze. With Cold Mastery, this is kind of just a filler because I haven't thought of something better yet. If you have any suggestions, put them down in the comments below. Energy Retention. So this has a higher chance to reproc because it has a higher chance to retain the energy it gained. And Impetus to gain energy faster. This secondary Comet is really just to clean up extra spare mobs, and it isn't particularly needed for dropping on rares. Plus, let's be honest, it hits hard enough as is. So going for all the energy stuff absolutely felt worth it. Last, but certainly not least, Blasphemy. This reserves Spirit to turn a curse into an aura. The bigger the AoE on the curse, such as with Magnified Effect and Ritualistic Curse, as you can see here, the curse radius, 5.5 meters, will allow you to affect as many enemies as possible, slowing them down and making it much easier to dodge. And so that's what I'm doing currently. But there's a very good chance that it's going to change in the future, as I play more, get better gear, do higher content, and simply learn more about Path of Exile 2. So there's 2 ways that you can ensure that you know the most about the build and the changes I make. The first is to get subscribed and ring the notification bell, because every time I make a major change, I'm going to make an update video. And hey, you made it to the end of the video, probably liked it, so leave a like while you're down there. And I'm also going to have a planner over on Maxroll. This one is not going to be a snapshot of everything in the here and now. Instead, it's going to be updated over time. Which means, by the time you look at it, it may not match the video at all. That's perfectly normal and to be expected. If you want to see my character exactly as it is now, you have a video. If you want to see whatever I end up doing in the future, then click over to the Maxroll planner. Though that said, if I pivot completely, like let's just say I end up going Lightning Conduit because I think that's really cool, or I make an arc build, something that is completely different from what I'm playing right now, then I'd probably not only make a separate video, but make a separate planner as well, because it's really not the same build. But if I do something like change out Fireball for Eye of Winter, that would be pretty much the same build, so it's going to be part of a planner update. And so that takes me to the what I'm doing next part of a video. And the answer is doing more maps and farming more content, because I don't really know what I need to change. Do I need more damage? Do I need more defenses? Right now, both feel really good for the content that I'm doing. But I don't know how it's going to change between doing tier 9 maps and doing, say, tier 16 maps. I'm definitely going to need to play the build more. With that said, as much as I feel like I should be dropping Cast on Freeze, I'm probably going to keep it for a bit longer. It's really satisfying to see those comets crashing down, even if they aren't super impactful. Because half the time, it crashes down on a frozen normal monster that's already in culling range. The other half the time, it breaks a bunch of frost walls and detonates the entire screen. Again, I do think something like Grim Feast would add a lot of recovery, and maybe even a second curse in the Blasphemy setup could be used with a 5-link to make enemies even weaker, or possibly cause them to take increased damage with something like Frostbite. I don't 100% know where I'm going to go from here in that regard. But in terms of my gear, I'm really happy with how things turned out. At 5.5k ES, I feel really tanky. Turns out being able to just dodge roll and recover your ES while you're dodge rolling feels phenomenal. And having the frost walls and then detonating them with a fireball does incredible damage. Like I said before, I'm pretty much just deleting rares as soon as they enter my screen and get frozen. With that said, if you've been playing the build, I'm curious. How's it been going for you, and is there anything you're struggling with? Be sure to let me know down in the comments below. Now, if you want a version of this build that works with much less gear, I strongly recommend you look at my previous video, where right after the trigger nerfs, I hard pivoted what I was doing into a similar setup. What I was using there was life-based. It was much squishier, but it was also wearing gear that was very cheap minus a couple of pieces. So that's much easier to do. If you're wondering about leveling, you can check out my video on how I leveled this character. However, as a warning, I did use Cast Unfreeze Comet, which no longer works in the form that I used it in. So if you're going to level, I suggest you stick with Spark and Flame Wall. Though you can do some Cast Unfreeze Cold Snap stuff. The downside of that is enemies instantly unfreeze. The upside of that is it has a much lower cast time, so it's very easy to generate enough energy. Yeah, I'll link both of those resources up in the card and down below. For now, I'm going to get back to mapping. I have to say, it has been really fun to map in Path of Exile 2. Because the combat is so much more responsive. It's no longer about mindlessly running through hordes of enemies and just pressing one button and watching everything explode. I actually have to think about, oh, that guy, I want to just open the Comet. It's not optimal for damage, but it instantly freezes and shocks him, so I can set up something else. That guy, he's a melee guy. He's not going to get to me. I can wall him off with some frost walls, put a frost bomb below, shoot a fireball in, he'll get nuked. Or if those enemies over there, they're standing near a wall anyway, no need for frost wall, just fireball away, fire in the hole, watch them melt. So yeah, in short, that combat has been really engaging for me. I've been loving it, and that's probably why when the build was nerfed, my response wasn't to God, the world is ending. The response was, okay, but whatever cool stuff can I do? Because I've really been enjoying the game. That's also why I wanted to share my build, so that other people can have fun with the game too, because that thing is pretty awesome. So that said, thanks for watching to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.